Well, good morning, everyone. Good evening, whatever time of day it is that you're watching this. We are coming to you with a little bit of a throwback structure here. I've got Jordan as a guest. He's now a guest because the last few weeks I've been doing Sunday school stuff on my own. So Jordan, welcome.
I got farmed out to the junior leagues in southern Alabama. I've earned my stripes and I've got a call up back to the first team. So I'm grateful to Captain Drew for allowing me to be back with you all.
We're glad you're here. The reason that I asked Jordan to join me today was because I got a little bit of feedback from a couple of people about the last lecture on Abraham Kuiper and the Reformed tradition and how it interacts with society and culture. And that feedback was that was all very dense. Could we unpack it a little bit? And so that's what Jordan and I are kind of here to do today. So we're going to talk a little bit more about Abraham Kuiper and how he interacts with the Reformed tradition, how he's a representative of the Reformed tradition, and then just talk a little bit about Kyperian theology and what it has to say about particularly how we interact with society and culture. So Jordan, let's start with who is Abraham Kuiper? Can you sort of orient us a little bit in history and his life?
Sure, I think if you were, in modern terms, you'd call Abraham Kuiper a Renaissance man. He was somebody that wore many hats and had a very sort of storied career and had several kind of key jobs. So the main things that he's kind of known for was he was a minister in the Dutch church, which would later become the New Dutch Reformed Church, and which he helped kind of shape.
Yeah.
He owned a printing house and he published a newspaper. So he was the editor of a newspaper, and he was a member of the Dutch Parliament, and their equivalent of the Senate, and he would go on to become the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. And he served just at the turn of the 20th century, so from 1901 to 1905.
Yeah.
So he served one term as Prime Minister of the Netherlands. And that was a really important time for the Netherlands. That was just after the Burr War. So the Burr War was in South Africa, where the couple of the provinces of South Africa at the time were Transvaal and the Orange Free State, which was where the Afrikaner settlers were. And so he kind of played a pivotal role in sowing the seeds for what South Africa would become for the 20th century, and sort of being an architect of the sunset of the Netherlands colonial empire, which other colonial empires around them would kind of take a lead on. So he was a minister, he was a newspaperman, he was a public servant, and he was a prime minister.
Yeah, and just those facts about his life really illustrate some of what we're going to talk about with his theology of culture and society. That he was very happy living in all of those worlds and kind of doing it all at the same time, and all of that being a part of not just who he was, but what he felt Christians were called to do and be in the world. Yeah, that's good. Okay, so Jordan, tell me about what was your first encounter with Kuiper and Kyperian theology, just in your studies and things?
Yeah, so it would have been in my undergrad. I came across Abraham Kuiper. We did a class on Neo-Calvinism, and so obviously Calvinism, stemming back to Geneva, to Calvin, and the authority of Scripture, the supreme, the holiness of God, and the importance of the saints, the church, and Neo-Calvinism was sort of in vogue. Way back in 2010 when my first year of my undergrad. And there's some prominent, like Tim Keller, obviously, another guy, Mark Driscoll, who some of you may have heard of. And it was kind of the in vogue thing to be Neo-Calvinist. And I think I was like, oh yeah, Neo-Calvinism started in 2005 in a Starbucks in Seattle. But really, it was the turn of the 20th century of articulating. So when we think of Calvin, we talked about Geneva and how he archetyped a city that was said to be, this is like God's city on earth. And this is where all the rules are obeyed, where everyone lives as a Christian, everyone lives in harmony. But on the other hand, it's if you challenged it, you were burnt at the stake. There were no Jews there were no Muslims there was zero diversity. It was like an authoritarian, tyrannical dictatorship of sorts.
Yeah.
Where the religious forces policed things brutally.
Yeah.
And that doesn't seem like the loving, compassionate kingdom of God.
Right.
And so Neo-Calvinism was formed at the turn of the 20th century of 200 or 300 years after Calvin was there. And what does it mean for Christians to live out their life socially? And you think that this is just 50 or 60 years after the American Civil War, a little bit longer after the French Revolution. And so one of the things that was radically challenged in both revolutions was what role does the state play and how is the state connected to the church?
Yeah.
And obviously in the British Empire, the king was head of the church. In the French Revolution, it was the Pope. And so there was a radical pushback across Europe at that time of, we do not trust religious authorities.
Right.
Because they're in the pocket of the king or the queen or whoever the ruler may be.
Yeah.
Kuyper formed an allegiance with the Catholics of the Netherlands at the time. And his party he started is still connected with so they're still equally represented by Catholics and by Protestants. And so his would say, well no, there has, in a true democracy, there has to be a role for religious freedom. And you can clearly see where that sort of echoes in American life.
Yeah.
So whereas across continental Europe, with a few exceptions, so UK is slightly different because the church is maintained, because the monarchy is maintained.
Yeah.
But across continental Europe, all the states essentially threw out the church. When you go a little bit further east, to the east, so like Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, still very like staunchly Catholic countries, but France, Italy, Spain, like the state influence of the church was effectively nixed. But the Netherlands is the exception to that, where the Reformed Church is still part of the national life.
Yeah, yeah, and
like on a political level.
Yes.
Not to say that those other countries don't have churches that are represented,
right?
But on the state level, there's a role for the church in life, and it's kind of interesting when we look what countries are the most liberal that we can think of. You would probably say Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands. They're probably the top three. But yeah, the Netherlands has had church influence from the get-go.
Yeah, and this idea of Neo-Calvinism intersects with a lot of figures that we might readily know their names, at least. We would think of people like Reinhold Niebuhr. We'd even think of maybe Martin Luther King Jr. Gets associated with Neo-Calvinism a little bit. So it's something that is sort of sweeping the religious landscape in the 20th century.
And even
it
like
kind of starts
the rapper Lecrae, he writes in his memoirs that he was very influenced by Kuyper and some of like his engagement.
Yeah, that's good. So Jordan, what's something that you find compelling about Kyperian theology?
I mean, several years ago, I was Keith Case, pastor of Providencia, and I were asked to go speak at a conference in Houston. And I was engaged in my initial role at Providencia was called a culinary priest. That was sort of like, I would put on meals for the church, I would engage and sort of get to know people in the restaurant world. And I was like very much living out of like, I could see the connections of sort of farm to table, how that's better for the earth, it's more sustainable. Our dollars go to local businesses as opposed to the big conglomeration. I could start to see of like, man, these are connecting. And there's a guy, Richard Mouw, M-O-U-W, who's sort of the grandfather of Neo-Calvinism, I guess you would say, of sort of like modern day Calvinism. And he kind of gave this speech, and he said, it was a Sunday morning, and he said, when a quarterback throws a pass and it soars through the air and goes into the end zone and the wide receiver catches it and the crowd goes wild, God sits back and says, that's good. And I was like, well, a quarterback, wide receiver, like, I think I know what's going on there. But just to say that, like...
American football.
Right. But to say that, like, we're like, what on earth does football have to do with God?
Right.
But it's like, these are athletes, God gave them ability, they're in the peak of their physical condition, and they're working at the highest aspect of they're able to do, and they're performing to the best of their God-given abilities. And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
And I was like, that seems so removed and so sort of like, not connected, but for Kuyper and for Mouw and people like Tim Keller, it's that God is intimately present in the everyday.
Yeah.
And you may think it's like in the brushing of your teeth, in the walking along Flagler at night on sort of a cool evening. Like there's the goodness of God there.
Yeah.
And so where Calvin has God is so holy. It's almost like the priests of the Old Testament, that when they went into the holiest of the holies, they would tie a string around their ankles and have one of their buddies hold it in case they did one of the ritual washings wrong and they were struck down and they had to be pulled out of the temple.
Yeah.
It's like Calvin has that much of a distance of God. But Kuiper and others who followed him would say that like God is intimately close and present to us in all that we do. And you best, and we see this in stuff like the Made to Flourish work that's been going on,
Right.
is that him as a journalist, his ability to write clearly, write succinctly, to present as sort of a balanced truth as possible, that was his Christian service, is that he was educating the nation.
Yeah.
Luther talked about if you're a Christian shoemaker, they should have the best heels in the country. That's how you serve God.
Right.
So it's in our everyday. It's in the sort of the ennui of everyday life. Is that is where God is present, and that's where we know Him and understand Him the most.
Yeah.
And that actually connects way back to the ancient Christians of the Desert Fathers, of the mystics, of God is present in my breathing.
Yeah.
God is present as I wake. God is all, and it's like very much a conversation that's happening just now. If you went to Barnes and Noble and went to the Christian life section, there would be books that talked about that, of how God is present in your every day.
Yeah. We would think about something like The Liturgy of the Ordinary, which is a book by Tish Harrison
Which
Warren.
the men's group read that.
It is a book that's kind of tagging off of this. And so what we see in Kuiper, and then more fleshed out in others through the 20th and into the 21st century, is this lowering of the barrier between the secular and the sacred.
Right.
And it's kind of a reaction against the kind of Enlightenment, the way that barrier had been erected in the Enlightenment, to sort of, you're talking about French Revolution, you're talking about phases in geopolitical things where it was like, we're going to divorce the church from the state, and we're going to erect this barrier, and Kuiper's trying to bring it down.
And I think it's like we're 120, 115 years later, and it's like, okay, how can we experience God in our drive to work? I mean, don't get annoyed when we get cut off in traffic. But Kuiper was sort of fighting the battle of, in sort of the realpolitik would be the phrase, like in the everyday experience of public life, in the founding of the state, in the nation's experience, is there a role for the church? And is there a role for Christians to influence that? And he's like, yes, there is. And I think we've reaped the benefit of that, and particularly in the States with the influence of how Neo-Calvinists informed their sort of the public structure of the equality of all believers would be the Christian phrase.
Right, yeah.
But sort of every vote counts. Every vote matters. There's a hierarchy we respect, but we elect them. You're not born into it. So there's so much connection that you see there. And I think we've just inherited that as sort of normative. And I think we owe a lot to sort of the reformers, the neo-reformers of the early 20th century, and how we've like really shaped and nuanced that view. Yeah,
and I think that we're seeing that even, again, fleshed out more in something like the Made to Flourish movement, where it's not just every vote and that kind of thing, but it's every job matters. So it's adding value or realizing the value in every single job that every single person is doing. And so then we can see, like the Made to Flourish network is working toward pastors having their role matter to society and to the cities that they're in and those kinds of things. And then at the same time thinking about blue-collar workers, white-collar workers, people who are doing all kinds of jobs, their role matters in the kingdom of God. So it's kind of going both ways between what we think of as the church or the kingdom of God and society and culture.
Yeah, and it's like the pastor's in the center, and everybody, no matter what job you do, from lawyer to shoemaker to candlestick maker to butcher, like whatever, all the arrows point in towards the pastor as they come there to be fed and to be taught more, whatever it is, pastoral care. But the role in this is the pastor's in the middle, and all the arrows are going out. Is that the church and the pastor equips people to say that whatever you do, it matters to God. It's how you serve God. It's what God has called you to. And your worship is, yes, you come to church on Sunday morning, but your real Christian giving isn't your tithe, isn't your time. It's how do you influence whatever sphere you're in, and how that changes the fabric of the city. Which is the really crucial piece, is that it's not just your internal spiritual life being transformed, it's that you are an agent of change in the city, in the nation, in the world. And it's like those, and I think that's the Great Commission. Is sort of those concentric circles of your immediate sphere, the slightly further away sphere, and then the global sphere.
Yeah, and Kuiper names that culture making.
Yes.
He's talking about the way we cultivate things and the way we have influence in society. That's how we make culture, not just for ourselves, but as a collective, and as a nation, as a world. Yeah. Okay, so last question is, we talked a little bit about what you find compelling in Kyperian theology. Is there anything you find challenging or that you want to kind of push back on a little bit?
So I think the phrase culture making is the one where I'm kind of like, yes, okay. As a prefix, and I think this is the cultural moment we're in, is that there's a reckoning with how do we deal with the mixed legacy of historical figures.
Right.
And particularly people that had political influence.
Sure.
And there's no greater political influence than being the head of state.
Yeah, prime minister.
And so I think that, I remember a lot of professors kind of said, well, he was a product of his time, and but I think you can't excuse it that simply. Is that there, no matter what historical issue you look at, whether it be slavery, whether it be women couldn't vote, like whatever it is that there was always people that dissented. There was always voices of critique.
Yeah.
And so the turn of the 20th century was pre-World War I, was really the peak for all the colonial powers. The economy was booming, their control was great, and they were reaping the rewards of several hundred years of benefiting from the free labor, slavery, and from the material and mineral goods of other countries.
Yeah.
In Belgium and the Netherlands, it was predominantly rubber and gold.
Okay.
From sort of the heart of Africa. Belgium had more of an influence in the heart of Africa. The Netherlands had one or two colonies in South Africa, a little bit of influence in Namibia, modern-day Namibia, a little bit in the top of Southern America, so like Guyana. Okay. But then the Dutch East Indies was the big one. Right. So the Malay Peninsula. And so much wealth. And it's how did Kuiper, and this is particularly in South Africa. So after the Burr War, the British win. It started as a revolt by two provinces, the Dutch Transvaal and the Orange Free State. So Bloemfontein would be the big city today, where they discovered gold and they discovered diamonds. Okay. And the British had sort of given, it was just like farmland. They had said, you kind of do your thing, whatever. Yeah. And then from London, they saw the gold glistening in the mine, and they said, all right, boys, we're going to take this back for God and King. And so they went in, easily defeated the farmers. And then there was a conversation afterwards of, what are we going to do with these thousands of people that have lived here for a couple of generations? Are we going to give them land? And Kuiper went to bat for them and said, these people should be here. We should give them land. We should give them power. And that essentially sets up what would become apartheid, is that you have the white Afrikaners, who make up less than 10% of the population of South Africa, go on to rule. Yeah. And you're like, obviously, Kuiper didn't sit down at his desk in Amsterdam and is like, I'm going to create apartheid. Right. And it's just the inability to see that, what culture are you making? And it's he wrote about Islam, and it was I forget what the title is of the book, but I can send a link it. But it wasn't a critique. Right. It was he went to a political meeting in Constantinople, now Istanbul. And he just talked about his curiosity of discovering Islam. Yeah. And it was pretty biased. He negatively talks about how he thought the women didn't have a voice, but he also was really curious about, they seem like good, hospitable people, but more of just like a curiosity of, wow, this is something I haven't discovered before. Yeah. But his fingerprints on the sunset of the Dutch colonial empire and what that sets up is deeply, deeply troubling. Yeah. And especially when he talks about culture making, it's that, and this is just so true, and Drew and I have beat this drum a lot, of the culture that Christianity made was Western only. Yeah. And it was Enlightenment only. Yeah. It was white male only. Yeah. And that did such a disservice to what was there. Yeah. And that's deeply troubling. And I think that it's difficult when you see such a flaw. It's how do you have a redemptive conversation about everything else? Yeah. And in God's wisdom and in God's grace, He's used this work to do incredible stuff. And I do think, like, yeah, there's a lot of good here. Yeah. But also, I think that that Calvinism and Calvinists, Neo-Calvinists, it can become this sort of tribal loyalty.
Right.
It's like, this is my doctrine, this is who I am, sola fide, 5 points, let's go. But I think we have to have more of a gentleness and more of an approach to say, like, this is a helpful framework, but I think that this framework, in its pursuit of truth, belittled, killed, and destroyed dissenting opinion.
Yeah.
And I don't think that is, I think it's not a stretch to say that's not the Christian way to do things.
Yeah. Yeah. I talked a little bit last week about what the word Kuyper uses is pluriformity, and he has a great appreciation for pluriformity, what Richard Mouw calls manyness. Right. So like just the kind of diversity. We might use the word diversity in the 21st century. But Kuyper uses this word pluriformity, and he even goes so far as to say that like something like uniformity is like the greatest sin, or the kind of he's looking at the Tower of Babel and he's going, okay, all one language. This is obviously not the way God wanted things, and then out of the Tower of Babel, we get pluriformity. And it's just like to piggyback on what you're saying, it's such a shame that he doesn't take that idea of pluriformity to a good conclusion.
Right.
He doesn't say
it's pluriformity for curiosity's sake.
Yeah.
And so
rather than you all should influence us.
So there was this will shock you, but it's true. There were zoos, and they were called zoos in Belgium and the Netherlands at that time that had black people dressed in their indigenous clothes, working in the fields, building huts, so people could go and look.
Wow.
And that was up until
without traveling somewhere.
And that was up until the 30s. That went on in the 30s, and right there.
Wow.
And so it's like it's the Victorian freak show. Like it's that sort of like, oh, this is so different. Let's look at it. And it's like repugnant. It makes like your skin kind of crawl.
Yeah. No, that is a big challenge, and it makes me think maybe we could have another conversation at another time about that kind of redemptive way of thinking. We've asked that question several times, but actually kind of hitting on how do we do that is an interesting question. Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
My pleasure. It's good to be here. It's good to be.
Appreciate it. It's fun to talk about Kuyper.
Yeah, sure.
You know, it's there's some good stuff in there, and there's some challenging stuff in there. So I hope this has been helpful to you, us unpacking this strain of the Reformed tradition that we get through Abraham Kuiper. There's still a huge influence coming from Kuiper in the 21st century. I named a few people last week, but we've talked about Richard Mouw. We've mentioned James K.A. Smith several times. I think you all have read one of his books as well. He's definitely sitting squarely in the Kyperian tradition and sort of pushing it in a different direction, which is cool.
Yeah, and it's like very much sort of like the public intellectual. Yeah, is the role that they have. Yeah. Tim Keller, another one.
Yeah, Tim Keller for sure. That's good. Well, thanks, Jordan.
My pleasure.
Good to be with you all, and we'll see you soon.